After breaking up my parents' marriage, my stepmom tried to make me call her mom. I'm Emily, 28, newly married to the absolute love of my life, Henry. He's the calm to my chaos and somehow tolerates my habit of stress baking at 2 a.m. growing up, though things weren't exactly picture perfect. My parents, Grace and Daniel, were, at least for the first 10 years of my life, what you might call the dream team. My mom was this superwoman who could juggle a full-time job, PTA meetings, and still make homemade spaghetti sauce like it was no big deal. My dad? Total life-of-the-party guy. He was the one who'd turn a boring Tuesday into a backyard barbecue just because the weather was nice. But when I was 10, the cracks started to show. I wasn't old enough to understand everything, but I could pick up on the tension. The late-night arguments, the way my mom would go quiet when my dad came home later than usual, the weirdly formal tone they used around me, like they were trying too hard to pretend everything was fine. And then came the bombshell. My dad had been having an affair. To say it was devastating would be an understatement. My mom was heartbroken, obviously, but she kept it together for me. She sat me down, explained the situation in a way I could kind of grasp, and promised me that no matter what, we'd be okay. My dad moved out not long after, and they finalized the divorce within a year. My mom got primary custody, and I stayed with her full-time, only seeing my dad on weekends, when I felt like it, which wasn't often at first. I like to say that things got better quickly, but that's not how life works, right? My relationship with my dad was complicated. I was angry, confused, and honestly, I felt like I had to pick a side. My mom never badmouthed him, though. In fact, she was the one who encouraged me to keep seeing him, even when I resisted. I think she just wanted me to have some kind of relationship with him, which, looking back, was incredibly selfless of her. 2 years after the divorce, my dad dropped another bombshell. He was getting remarried. To Sophie. Yep, the Sophie. The woman he'd been seeing before the divorce. I remember sitting across from him in the diner where we'd meet for our awkward weekend breakfasts, trying to process what he'd just said. He looked so nervous, like he was expecting me to throw my orange juice at him or something. I didn't, but let's just say my congratulations was about as enthusiastic as a DMV employee on a Monday morning. Sophie tried. I'll give her that. She'd ask me about school, invite me to go shopping, even tried baking cookies with me once. But I couldn't shake the feeling that being nice to her was somehow betraying my mom. I know it sounds dramatic, but that's how 12-year-old me saw it. And then, when Sophie had a miscarriage about a year into their marriage, things got even more complicated. She started pushing harder to bond with me, like really hard. At one point, she asked if I'd start calling her mom. I shut that down real fast. So, fast forward to earlier this year, when Henry and I were deep in wedding planning mode. You know how people say weddings bring out the best and worst in families? Yeah, they weren't kidding. I mean, I'd always known that my family dynamics were complicated, but I didn't realize just how much until I had to make decisions that, apparently, everyone thought they had a say in. The first big issue? The walk down the aisle. I knew from the start that I wanted my mom to walk me down. She's been my rock through everything, and honestly, it just felt right. I thought my dad would understand, or at least accept it, but nope. When I told him, he got quiet, like the kind of quiet where you just know something's about to go down. He finally said, "Don't you think that's a little unfair?" I was caught off guard, like, unfair to who? To me, he said, looking genuinely hurt. I'm your father, Emily. I should be the one walking you down the aisle. Now, I get it. I really do. I'm sure he had this whole vision in his head of being the proud dad, handing me off to Henry, and having that picture-perfect moment. But here's the thing. That vision didn't match my reality. My reality was that my mom was the one who stayed up with me when I had nightmares, who showed up to every parent-teacher conference, who taught me how to drive without completely losing her mind, mostly. My dad? He was there, sure, but not in the same way. I tried to explain this to him as gently as I could, but he wasn't having it. And then, of course, Sophie had to chime in. We were having this conversation at their house. Yes, I still go over for the occasional dinner, mostly out of obligation. And Sophie jumped in with, I think what your dad is trying to say is that this is a once-in-a-lifetime moment. It's important for him to feel included. I bit my tongue because, honestly, what I wanted to say was, you're not my mom, so maybe sit this one out. But I didn't. Instead, I just repeated, I've made my decision. Mom's walking me down the aisle. And that's when Sophie dropped the line that really set me off. Well, maybe you should reconsider who's been there for you these past few years. Your dad and I have done everything to make you feel like part of this family. Part of this family. Those words stuck with me, and not in a warm, fuzzy way. I felt my face get hot, but I just stood up, grabbed my bag, and said, "Thanks for dinner. I'll see you guys later." When I got home, I called my mom and vented for a solid hour. She listened like she always does, and then said, "Emily, this is your day. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for doing what feels right to you." I love her so much. Anyway, I thought that was the end of it, but oh no, things were just getting started. A few days later, Sophie texted me asking if we could meet for coffee. Against my better judgment, I said yes. I figured maybe she wanted to clear the air or apologize for overstepping. Spoiler, that's not what happened. So, we meet up at this little coffee shop downtown. I got there first because, well, I'm a sucker for being early, and I figured if things went south, at least I'd have caffeine to cling to. Sophie came in a few minutes later, all smiles, and sat down across from me. "Thanks for meeting me," she started, her voice all soft and sweet. It was the same tone she used when she first tried to buddy up with me years ago. I nodded, not really trusting myself to say anything yet. She launched into this whole spiel about how much she cared about me, how she's always tried to be there for me, and how she just wants my wedding to be a beautiful day for everyone. And, okay, up to this point, I was still managing to keep my cool. Barely. But then she said, "I just feel like your dad and I have worked so hard to build a relationship with you, and it's hurtful to see you prioritize your mom over us, especially on such an important day. Don't you think it's time to move forward?" Move forward. The way she said it, like I was clinging to the past or something, made my stomach turn. I set my coffee down and looked her straight in the eye. "Sophie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "this isn't about picking sides. My mom has been my constant through everything. This is about honoring that." She leaned forward, all serious now. "I get that, I really do. But don't you think your dad deserves to be honored, too? He's your father." I took a deep breath, reminding myself not to let this turn into a public scene. "Look," I said, "I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to be part of my life. But this is my wedding. My decision. I'm not changing my mind." And that's when she dropped the bomb. "Well, your dad's really upset. He's even talked about not coming to the wedding at all if he feels excluded." I just blinked at her. Like, did she really just say that? I could feel my heart racing, partly from anger and partly from disbelief. Was this some kind of emotional blackmail? I pushed my chair back a little, suddenly feeling like I needed more space between us. "So what?" I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "He's going to skip my wedding because I want my mom to walk me down the aisle? Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds?" Sophie looked taken aback, like she wasn't expecting me to push back that hard. "That's not what I'm saying," she backpedaled. "I'm just saying he's hurt, and I think if you gave this more thought." "No." I cut her off. "I've thought about this plenty, and if my dad wants to miss my wedding because of one moment that doesn't go his way, that's on him. Not me." I could see her eyes start to water, and for a split second, I felt bad. But then she said something I'll never forget. "You know, we were hoping that when we lost the baby, it might bring us all closer together. Make you see me as part of your family." My jaw actually dropped. Like, what do you even say to that? I didn't even know they had thought of their miscarriage that way. And honestly, it felt manipulative to bring it up in this context. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and said, "I think we're done here." She called after me as I walked out, but I didn't look back. I was furious. Furious at her for putting that on me. Furious at my dad for letting her get involved in something so personal. And honestly, furious at myself for even agreeing to that coffee in the first place. That night, my dad called. I didn't pick up, but he left a voicemail. It was emotional, to say the least. He apologized for Sophie's comments, but also doubled down on how hurt he was about the aisle situation. I didn't call him back right away. I needed time to process everything. After the coffee shop disaster, I decided to go low contact for a bit. Between Sophie's emotional guilt-tripping and my dad's silence, I just needed space. Henry, as always, reminded me to focus on us and not let the noise ruin the wedding we were planning. But I'd be lying if I said the whole thing didn't weigh on me. A couple of weeks later, my dad texted, asking to meet up. "Just no Sophie." I hesitated. I was still angry, but eventually agreed. We ended up meeting at a park near his house. When I got there, he was already sitting on a bench, staring out at the water. For a minute, neither of us said anything. Finally, he broke the silence. "Emily, I didn't handle this well," he started, fiddling with his hands. I guess I didn't realize how much I'd hurt you. Back then, and now." I blinked. My dad isn't exactly the apologize first type, so this caught me off guard. He kept going, though, his voice a little shaky. "I've been holding on to this idea of how I thought your wedding would go, and when you said you wanted your mom to walk you down the aisle, it just hit me harder than I expected. I'm sorry for making it about me." That threw me. I didn't expect him to actually admit that. "I appreciate that," I said cautiously. "But Dad, this isn't about choosing one of you over the other. It's about honoring the person who's been there for me in a way I needed. That doesn't mean you're not important to me, but this is my decision." He nodded slowly, looking down at his hands. "I understand," he said, though he sounded sad. "I do." For a second, I thought we'd finally reached a good place, but then, of course, he added, "Sophie's been struggling with this too, you know. She feels like you've shut her out completely." I sighed, my frustration bubbling back up. "Dad, this isn't about Sophie. This is about us. I need you to stop making her feelings my responsibility." He opened his mouth like he wanted to argue, but stopped himself. After a moment, he nodded again. "Okay," he said quietly. The day of the wedding came faster than I expected. One second I was drowning in seating charts and stressing over floral arrangements, and the next, I was standing in a room full of my bridesmaids, trying not to cry as my mom helped me into my dress. She looked stunning, by the way, this gorgeous navy gown that made her look like someone straight out of a magazine. "You okay, sweetie?" she asked, adjusting my veil. I nodded, even though my stomach was doing somersaults. "Yeah, just nervous." She gave me this knowing smile. "You got this, and no matter what happens out there, today is about you and Henry. Don't forget that." I nodded again, swallowing hard. I didn't want to admit it, but the question of whether my dad would even show up had been gnawing at me all morning. We hadn't spoken since that last call, and I'd told myself I was okay with whatever happened. But deep down, I knew it would hurt if he didn't come. Finally, it was time. The music started, and one by one, my friends and family made their way down the aisle. I peeked out from the back and saw Henry standing up front, looking as handsome as ever in his suit. Just seeing him there made me feel a little steadier, like everything was going to be okay no matter what. And then it was our turn. My mom squeezed my hand, and we stepped out together. The moment I saw the crowd, my heart skipped a beat. My dad was there, sitting in the second row, next to Sophie, his hands folded in his lap. He looked nervous, almost out of place, but he was there. I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I kept walking, focusing on Henry. My mom stayed composed, even though I could feel her hand trembling slightly in mine. When we reached the end of the aisle, she kissed my cheek and whispered, "I'm so proud of you," before stepping aside. The ceremony itself was perfect. Henry and I wrote our own vows, and by the time we exchanged rings, there wasn't a dry eye in the house. For those few minutes, it felt like all the drama and tension melted away, leaving just the two of us and the love we'd built together. After the ceremony, during the reception, my dad approached me. I was at the cake table, trying not to smudge my makeup while shoving a slice of lemon cake into my mouth. He cleared his throat, and I turned to see him standing there, looking a little unsure of himself. There was an awkward pause before he finally said, "You look beautiful, Em." "Thanks," I said, my voice tight. "I'm glad you came." He nodded, his eyes darting around like he was searching for the right words. I know I haven't made this easy for you, and I know I can't go back and fix everything, but I want you to know I'm proud of you. You've grown into an amazing woman." I felt my chest tighten. There were so many things I wanted to say, so many years of feelings I hadn't sorted through, but in that moment I just nodded. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot." He smiled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it didn't feel forced. Sophie didn't come over, thankfully, and I didn't go out of my way to find her. I figured we'd both said all we needed to say. But for the rest of the night, my dad stayed low-key, no drama, no guilt trips. He even danced with me during the father-daughter dance, though I'd originally planned it to be just me and my mom. I decided to let it happen in the moment, and surprisingly, it felt okay. By the end of the night, I realized something. My dad isn't perfect, and neither is our relationship. But maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe just showing up in whatever way he can is enough for now. So yeah, complicated families are complicated. But at the end of the day, I married the love of my life, surrounded by the people who mattered most. And honestly, that's all I could have asked for.